I'm Claire, 29, and I've spent years watching powerful people underestimate quiet ones. Every week, I bring you true stories of betrayal, hidden power, and the moment the truth finally comes out. Stay till the end, it always does. You're just an assistant, know your place. Those 6 words came out of Marcus Bell's mouth like they cost him nothing. He said them in a boardroom full of 12 people, 3 of them investors flying in from New York, all of them watching me like I was something that had wandered in off the street. I was standing at the head of the table with a laptop in my hands and a presentation I had built for 11 nights straight. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I simply closed the laptop, sat down in the chair at the far end of the table, the one nobody wanted, the one closest to the door, and said nothing. Marcus smiled. He thought he'd won. He had no idea that in 14 minutes, 2 men in gray suits were going to walk through that door, shake my hand first, and call me chairwoman. To understand how we got to that moment, you have to go back further than 3 weeks. You have to go back almost 2 years to a hospital room in Denver and a man who was running out of time. My name is Claire Whitfield. I'm 29 years old, and for the last year and a half, I've worked at Halden Freight Analytics, a logistics software company in Denver, under the official title of Executive Assistant to the CEO. That's the title on my badge. That's the title in the directory. That's the only thing anyone in that building ever bothered to learn about me. What isn't on my badge is this. My father, Richard Whitfield, spent 30 years building companies most people never heard of. He wasn't the kind of businessman who wanted his name on buildings. He believed something old-fashioned, that a company's worth showed in how it treated the person answering its phones, not in how it treated its biggest client. He funded 4 struggling startups in the last decade of his life, quietly, through a small holding firm nobody outside our family knew existed. Halden Freight Analytics was the last one. He believed in it so much that in the final year of his illness, from a hospital bed with an oxygen line taped under his nose, he made me promise something. "Don't just inherit it, Claire," he said. His voice was thin by then, but his eyes were exactly as sharp as they'd always been. "Anyone can inherit a company. Go find out what it actually is first. Go find out who's really running it, and whether he deserves what I built." I asked him how I was supposed to do that. "Walk in the front door like everybody else," he said. "Nobody tells the truth to the owner's daughter. They'll tell the truth to the new assistant." He passed 6 weeks later, and when the paperwork settled, I inherited 61% of a company I had never worked inside, enough to control every major decision on paper, and 0 real knowledge of what actually happened inside those walls day to day. So I did exactly what he asked. I changed nothing about my appearance, nothing about my resume, except the one detail that mattered. I used my mother's maiden name. Whitfield became Bennett. Claire Bennett, 28 years old on the application, 3 years of admin experience, a made-up but plausible employment history that a friend of my father's helped me build so it would hold up to a background check. I applied for the only open position in the company that quarter, assistant to the CEO, and I got it in 9 days, mostly because nobody who actually wanted power ever applies for a job like that. The CEO was Marcus Bell, 41 years old, hired by the board 2 years before my father's death, before any of us knew how sick he really was. On paper, Marcus was exactly what a growing software company wants. Wharton MBA, a decade at 2 other logistics startups, 1 modest exit under his belt, the kind of easy charisma that makes a boardroom feel like it's already won before the numbers even come up. My father's holding firm had approved his hire from a distance, based entirely on a polished pitch and glowing references. Nobody had watched him do the actual job. I was about to. It took less than a month to understand what kind of man he really was. Marcus was 2 different people, depending on who was in the room. To the board, to investors, to anyone whose opinion could affect his own trajectory, he was warm, quotable, full of phrases like, "We're not just a logistics company, we're rebuilding trust in supply chains." The kind of line that sounds good in a pitch deck and means nothing on a Tuesday afternoon when a client's shipment is 3 weeks late. To the 22 people who actually worked under him, he was something else entirely. Dismissive, quick to blame, allergic to sharing credit. I saw it within my first 2 weeks. A data analyst named Priya Nair, 24 years old, sharp, the kind of quietly brilliant that never gets noticed in a room full of loud people, had built a client retention model that identified which accounts were at risk of leaving before they actually left. It saved the company an $800,000 contract in her first month on the team. In the board meeting where that number came up, Marcus described it as a strategic retention initiative I put in place. Priya's name never came up. She was sitting 3 seats down from him when he said it. I watched her stare at her notebook and say nothing. I understood exactly why. I'd already learned, in 2 short weeks, that saying something to Marcus cost you more than it was worth. He called me the assistant from day one. Never Claire, never Ms. Bennett, just the assistant. The way you'd refer to a piece of equipment. He'd snap his fingers mid-phone call for a coffee refill. He'd hand me his dry cleaning ticket like I was a hotel concierge. Small things, at first. Things you could tell yourself were just a busy man's bad habits. Then they stopped being small. About 4 months in, I caught an error in a contract renewal for one of our largest clients, a clause that had been copy-pasted from an old template and left our liability exposure completely unprotected. It would have cost the company over $2 million if the client ever tried to walk away mid-contract. I brought it to Marcus quietly, the way I brought him everything, expecting a thank you at minimum. He read it for exactly 4 seconds and laughed. Not with me, at me. "Cute that you think you understand contracts, sweetheart," he said, loud enough that 2 people at the nearby desks heard it. "Stick to my coffee order." I fixed it anyway. I rewrote the clause myself that night, using contract language I remembered from years of watching my father review agreements at our kitchen table. And I quietly routed it through legal the next morning, under a memo that made it look like their own oversight. Nobody ever knew it was me. The contract got fixed. The company stayed protected. Marcus never found out how close he'd come to losing $2 million because he couldn't be bothered to read 4 sentences carefully. That was the moment something in me changed. I stopped hoping he'd become a better man. I started paying attention like it was my job, because in the truest sense, it was. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't plotting revenge in those early months. I was doing exactly what my father asked me to do. Watching, learning, building an honest picture of what Halden Freight Analytics actually was underneath the pitch deck. But an honest picture, it turned out, was an ugly one. I watched Marcus expense a team offsite to Cabo San Lucas that was, in reality, 4 days of golf with 3 friends from business school, none of whom worked at the company. I watched him miss a critical deadline on a client integration because he'd sat on the final sign-off for 6 days while dealing with a personal matter, and then watched him tell the board, without hesitation, that the delay was due to execution issues on the data team, Priya's team, the same team that had delivered everything on schedule. I watched him take a growth strategy slide deck that I had built almost entirely myself, under his direction, but with my analysis, my market research, my actual recommendations, and present it to the board as his vision for where Halden goes next. He got a standing ovation. I stood in the back of the room, holding his coffee, and clapped along with everyone else. Every night after that, I went home to my apartment, and before I did anything else, I opened a folder on my personal laptop that I had named, with a kind of grim humor, homework. Nobody at Halden knew it existed. In it, I logged everything. Dates, dollar amounts, screenshots of Slack messages where Marcus mocked employees by name in a private channel he thought only his inner circle could see. A channel I'd been quietly added to months earlier because someone assumed the assistant wouldn't understand what she was reading. Emails I forwarded to my own private account the moment they crossed my desk. Within a year, that folder held roughly 300 documents, a paper trail thick enough to end a career, if it ever needed to. I told myself for a long time that I was just building a complete picture, that I hadn't decided what to do with it yet. That's not entirely honest, looking back. Somewhere in month 10 or 11, watching Priya get blamed for a mistake that wasn't hers for the third time, I think I already knew exactly what I was going to do. I was just waiting for the right moment, because my father had taught me that too, that timing is the only thing that turns evidence into justice. The right moment arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of an email I was never supposed to see. Halden was in the middle of raising a Series C round, $40 million from a New York venture firm called Ashcroft Capital, the kind of round that would let the company scale nationally and finally compete with the two much larger logistics platforms eating our market share. Marcus wanted this deal badly. Badly enough, it turned out, to lie for it. The email came through on a shared drive I had access to, but wasn't supposed to open. An oversight in permissions nobody had bothered to fix since the last IT audit. It was a draft of the investor pitch deck, and next to it, an internal spreadsheet showing the real Q3 client retention numbers. The numbers in the pitch deck were 18% higher than the numbers in the internal spreadsheet. Not a rounding error, not an optimistic projection. A deliberate, calculated inflation, dressed up with different formatting so it wouldn't be obvious side by side unless you were specifically looking, which nobody at Ashcroft Capital had any reason to do, until they met the majority shareholder who'd been sitting 8 feet from Marcus's desk for over a year. This wasn't the kind of thing you fix quietly with a late-night contract rewrite. This was fraud. Real, prosecutable fraud. The kind that ends not just a CEO's job, but potentially his freedom. And the kind that could have taken my father's company down with him if Ashcroft Capital ever discovered it after the money had already changed hands. I sat with that email for 2 full days before I did anything. I want you to understand that this wasn't hesitation born of fear. It was the same instinct my father had. The instinct to be completely certain before you act. Because once you act, you can't undo it. I cross-referenced every number in that spreadsheet against 6 months of client invoices I had access to as the assistant. I confirmed it wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate, and it was Marcus's signature on the final deck approval. Then I made a phone call I hadn't made in over a year. Daniel Reyes had been my father's attorney for 2 decades. He was the only person outside my immediate family who knew that Claire Bennett and Claire Whitfield were the same person, because he was the one who'd helped me build the identity in the first place, at my father's request, before he passed. Daniel picked up on the second ring, and I told him everything: the 18 months, the folder called homework, the inflated retention numbers, all of it. He was quiet for a long moment when I finished. "Claire," he said finally, "you've had the legal power to fire this man since the day you signed your father's estate paperwork. You've just chosen not to use it." "I wanted to see who he really was first," I said. "Now I know." "So what do you want to do?" I told him. I wanted it to happen in front of the investors. Not because I wanted a spectacle. I want to be honest. There was some of that in me too, after 18 months of the assistant. But because the fraud itself was aimed directly at Ashcroft Capital's $40 million. They deserved to know exactly who they were about to fund, in the room, before a single wire transfer went through. Daniel made 2 calls that night. The first was to Warren Ashcroft himself, the founding partner of Ashcroft Capital, a man Daniel had known professionally for years through unrelated deals. The second was to 2 other members of Halden's 5-person board, quiet, long-tenured directors who had been appointed originally by my father's holding firm and who, it turned out, had their own private doubts about Marcus that they'd never had the standing to act on. By the following morning, those 2 directors had signed a document, prepared overnight by Daniel, placing Marcus on immediate administrative leave pending a fraud review, contingent only on my confirmation as majority shareholder, which Daniel would provide in person the moment I gave the word. The investor visit had a new item on its agenda. Marcus had no idea it existed. The morning of the meeting, I did exactly what I'd done for 18 months. I arrived early, I made his coffee. I printed his notes and organized them the way he liked, tabbed and color-coded, because that was the job, and until that morning, it was still my job to do it well. He barely glanced at me as he took the folder from my hands. "Sit in the back today," he said, not looking up from his phone. "Investors don't need to see the help." I sat in the back. For nearly 40 minutes, Marcus performed. And he was good at it. I'll give him that much even now. Confident, articulate, hitting every beat investors want to hear. He gestured at slides I had built. He quoted the inflated retention numbers I now knew, with certainty, were fabricated. Two men from Ashcroft Capital sat at the head of the table, older, composed, taking notes without much visible reaction, occasionally glancing toward the back of the room. Toward me. I didn't know yet that Warren Ashcroft had personally reviewed a summary of Daniel's findings on the flight in. Then came the moment. I stood up, not to speak, just to reach for the laptop I needed for the next slide, and Marcus, irritated at the interruption to his rhythm, snapped without even turning his head. "You're just an assistant. Know your place." The room went quiet, in that particular way rooms go quiet when everyone senses something ugly just happened, and nobody wants to be the one to react first. A few people looked at their laptops. One of the Ashcroft partners looked up, very slowly, and did not look away again. I sat back down. I closed the laptop. I said nothing. Marcus smiled at the investors and moved on to his next slide like nothing at all had happened. That's when the door opened. Daniel Reyes walked in first, in a gray suit, carrying a leather folder under one arm. Behind him, Warren Ashcroft rose from his seat at the head of the table. He didn't look at Marcus at all. He walked the full length of that boardroom, past the projector, past the head of Halden's own legal counsel, and stopped in front of me. He extended his hand. "Chairwoman Whitfield," he said, clearly enough that every person in that room heard it. "It's an honor to finally meet you in person." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever experienced in my life. Marcus's face didn't just fall. It collapsed, piece by piece, as understanding arrived in stages too slow for his own good. Whitfield, chairwoman. The name attached, he was only now realizing, to 61% ownership of the company he had spent 2 years running like it was entirely his own. "I don't," he started, half rising from his chair. "I'm sorry, there's some mistake. She's my assistant. Daniel set the leather folder on the table without a word and opened it. Inside were the notarized ownership documents establishing my controlling stake. Beside them, the internal retention spreadsheet next to the doctored investor deck, line by line, with the 18% discrepancy circled in red. And beneath both, a formal resolution, already signed by 3 of Halden's 5 board members, placing Marcus Bell on immediate administrative leave pending a full fraud investigation, effective the moment this meeting concluded. "Ms. Bennett," Marcus said, his voice cracking, defaulting instinctively to the only name he had ever bothered to learn. "Please, whatever's happening here, we can talk about this. We can fix." "My name," I said quietly, standing for the second time that morning, "is Claire Whitfield. My father spent 30 years building companies on the idea that the truth matters more than the pitch. You spent 2 years selling something else, and you were about to sell it to these gentlemen for $40 million. I turned to Warren Ashcroft directly. "The 18% inflation on Q3 retention in the deck you were shown this morning is fabricated. I have the real figures, time-stamped, and I have internal communications showing he knew before he approved the final version. I won't let this company take your firm's money under false pretenses, not while I have a say in what happens here, and I do." Warren nodded slowly, unhurried, the way men who have sat through 100 boardroom collapses tend to be. "That's exactly the kind of diligence we look for before we invest, Chairwoman. We'd still like to fund Halden's growth, just not under this leadership." Marcus was escorted out of the building that same afternoon. His badge was deactivated before he'd even cleared his desk of the golf trophies and framed magazine clippings he kept behind his chair. Security walked him to his car in full view of the office windows. Nobody looked away. The story moved through Halden in under an hour, the way stories like that always do. The assistant everyone had dismissed for 18 months, the one who fetched coffee and printed notes and sat in the back of every room that mattered, was, in fact, the majority owner who had spent that entire time quietly documenting every stolen idea, every misplaced blame, every casual cruelty aimed at the people with the least power to answer back. Priya found me in the break room late that afternoon, still visibly stunned, holding a mug she'd forgotten to drink from. "You knew this whole time?" she asked. "About all of it? About him blaming me for the integration delay?" I needed to see exactly who I was trusting with my father's company before I did anything, I said. "I'm sorry it cost you as much as it did while I figured that out." "What happens now?" "Now," I said, "the company finally gets run by someone who knows what you actually built." I promoted her to Director of Data Strategy the following month, with a retention model she'd designed, becoming a core part of the very pitch that eventually closed our funding round. 3 weeks after that boardroom, Halden Freight Analytics closed its Series C round, $40 million, under new interim leadership, under my own name this time, made fully public. Ashcroft Capital's press release included a line I had printed out and pinned above my desk, the same desk where I used to keep Marcus's coffee order taped to the monitor. Halden Freight Analytics is proud to announce new executive leadership under Chairwoman Claire Whitfield, whose quiet diligence protected investor trust before a single dollar changed hands. Marcus never worked in venture-backed tech again. Word travels fast in an industry that size, and the story of the CEO who inflated his numbers and lost everything to the assistant he humiliated in front of the people signing the check became, in certain circles, exactly the kind of cautionary tale founders tell each other at conferences, usually without ever learning my full name. I think about that morning often, not the handshake, not even the look on Marcus's face when the folder opened. I think about the 4 seconds right before it, his voice, careless, certain, saying 6 words to a woman he'd decided wasn't worth learning the name of. He was right about one thing, in the end. I was quiet. He just never understood that quiet and powerless were never the same thing. My father used to say that patience isn't the absence of power. It's power waiting for the right moment to be undeniable. I didn't understand what he meant until I was standing at the back of that room, watching a man dig his own grave one careless sentence at a time. And I finally understood exactly what he'd spent his whole life trying to teach me. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who mistook your patience for weakness, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one, and some of your stories are the reason I keep making these videos. And if you want to know what happened to Marcus after this, where he ended up, and what he tried to do 6 months later when he found out Halden had tripled in value, that story is coming next.